Way, Anna and Gerald, nice to see you here. Hope your trip west went well. There's a few visitors here with us today and a few faces I haven't seen for a while. Okay, Jeremy, how are you? I want to talk to you this morning. I'll turn this on. About a subject that I think is very relevant to our day, and I'm hoping that it's a message that's going to mean a lot to you as well. The subject is the Israel of God. Who is the Israel of God? If I was to ask you that question this morning, would you know in your own mind who was the Israel of God? When the Roman legions destroyed Jerusalem in AD 70, the people of Judea were deported and scattered throughout the Roman Empire. And so for the Jewish people, there was no longer a place that they could call home, their homeland as such. Largely absorbed into history and scattered around the nations of Europe, the Jewish people maintained their identity by living in community wherever they were scattered. In 1492, during the Spanish Inquisition, the Roman Catholic Church tried to force all non-Jews to be baptised as Christians. Sorry, all non-Christians to be baptised as Christians. And anyone who was, thank you, brother, anyone who was of Jewish origin or of the Islamic faith, the Moors who lived in Spain, were under the force of a sword or a spear, commanded to, hopefully that's working now, here we go, commanded to convert to Christianity. But for many Jews that was too hard for them, and so they left Spain. A lot went across the water to Morocco in North Africa, but a lot actually took the opportunity to go back to Palestine. And I went to Israel 2.5 years ago. Our tour guide was a descendant of these Spanish Jews. He had a very olive complexion. He didn't look Jewish at all to me. And I said, "So what's your ancestry?" And he said, "My ancestors were kicked out of Spain in 1492. And so for many years, the Jewish people didn't have a home to call their own. But the 19th century changed a lot of that, because with the 19th century came steam power, steam-powered ships, steam-powered trains, and the ability to move mass groups of people over long distances, something that had not been available before. And so a lot of Jews in the 19th century took the opportunity to leave Europe and travel to America. And a lot also travelled to Palestine. So the number of Jewish residents in Palestine was growing throughout the 19th century. There were persecutions taking place of minority groups in Europe that gave them the impetus to want to get out of those troubled places. And there were Jews in Europe we now had a more mobile society, a more educated society. There were Jews within Europe who started to agitate, if you like, or talk amongst themselves, talk to politicians about the possibility of them gaining their own homeland again. This man is Theodor Herzl. He was an Austrian Jew, and he established the world's first organisation known as the World Zionist Organisation. And it was their goal to establish a homeland again for the Jewish people back in Palestine. Now, you might think that that's a fairly worthy aspiration, and this was their first congress that was held in the city of Basel in Switzerland. And they sent delegates. Delegates came from all over Europe to this Zionist conference, where they discussed the possibilities of organising mass migration of Jewish people back to Palestine. And you might think that all Jewish people would be happy about this possibility, but it was not so. There were people at that time who didn't agree with the Zionist aspirations. And this is a quote from the Central Conference of American Rabbis about the very same time that Theodore Herzl was agitating for a Jewish homeland. And they said, "We consider ourselves no longer a nation but a religious community, and therefore expect neither a return to Palestine nor a sacrificial worship under the administration of the sons of Israel, nor the restoration of any of the laws concerning the Jewish state." So even amongst the Jewish people, there was divide over what should be done about their identity. 1905, there was a revolution in Russia. This was civil unrest towards the Tsarist government, resulted in the event known in history as the Bloody Sunday, the massacre of the crowds by the Tsarist troops. Part of the civil unrest that took place during this revolution was directed at minority groups within the Russian population. And there were some 3 million Jews, the largest population of Jews anywhere in Europe, living in Russia at the time. And they were persecuted by rival factions within Russia who took it out on the Jews. And there were several thousand of them who were killed during the rioting and lawlessness that took place at that time. So bad was it that a lot of Jews took the opportunity and migrated to the United States of America. But a portion of them did make it down into Palestine as well. And so they jumped on. One other event that took place shortly after that was the First World War. And during the First World War, the Arabs who lived in Palestine were encouraged by the British to join forces with them and push the Turks out of the Middle East. So the Ottoman Empire was collapsing as part of World War I, and the British promised the Arabs their own autonomous government in return for their assistance. Well, so did the man known as Lawrence of Arabia. That's him there. T.E. Lawrence. He worked alongside those Arab soldiers, and he was the one who promised the Arabs that you would finally have your own autonomous government in return for your assistance during the war. But at the end of the First World War, the British Foreign Secretary, a man by the name of Arthur James Balfour, had other ideas, because wealthy Jewish people in Great Britain had been lobbying for some time to this man, the British Foreign Secretary, to establish a Jewish homeland in Palestine because of all the persecutions they had endured. And at the time of the Russian Revolution, the revolution in 1917, some 150,000 Jewish people were murdered, mostly in the Ukraine. Nearly 2 million Jews fled Russia and went to the United States of America. But there was this very significant population that also went down into Palestine. And so they jumped on their boats and they headed on down. Now, Israel is not a big country. Has anyone been there? Has anyone been there? It's about 80 kilometres wide and about 200 kilometres long. It's not a big country. And you start offloading boatload after boatload of immigrants into what is pretty much a developing nation. You're putting a lot of pressure on the local inhabitants who live there. And you can imagine what the local Arab people thought of the arrival of all these Jews. But it was probably this event in the Second World War that gave the greatest impetus for the Jewish migration to Israel and the establishment of a Jewish homeland, the Holocaust. These are the lucky ones. These are the ones who survived. And so at the end of the Second World War, the nations of Europe and United States and Great Britain said, the Jewish people really need their own homeland. And this was Palestine, as it was known at the end of the Second World War. And the British came up with the idea of giving the Jordanian people anything east of the River Jordan, the Jordanian royal family, that was going to be theirs. The area shaded in green would be for the Jewish people, and the darker grey patch would be for the resident Arab population of Palestine. And that was the plan that Britain had at the end of the Second World War, because they too wanted to get out of Palestine. They'd been administering it since the end of the First World War, and they no longer had the interest to stay there. And in May of 1948, there was an assembly of Jewish leaders in Israel, and this is a photo of David Ben-Gurion announcing the establishment of the nation of Israel. And it was met with glad news in the newspapers of the time in America and in Britain. Zionists proclaim a new state. Truman, that's Harry Truman, the American president, recognised the state of Israel, and he hoped for peace. But no sooner had the nation been proclaimed than the Egyptian army attacked this new nation of Israel. And the city of Tel Aviv was bombed and an invasion was ordered. In fact, Israel now found itself surrounded by several hostile Arab nations, Egypt and Jordan, Syria, Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, as well as its own resident Palestinian Arab population. And it would seem that this fledgling nation would not last very long against all the onslaught of her Arab neighbours. And perhaps against all odds, and there were several conflicts in 1949, in 1956, and again in 1967. This is probably one of the most famous, the Six-Day War. The Arab nations all lined up to take on Israel, and in 6 days the Israelis defeated all of their surrounding neighbours and secured their hold for the first time on the city of Jerusalem, which gave them access for the very first time to the Western Wailing Wall, which is the foundation stones of the old first century temple in Jerusalem. And for many people, the significance of this event sparked great interest. Was this going to be the time when that would initiate or usher in a messianic age? Now the Jewish people had their own homeland. Now they had control of Jerusalem. Was this the beginning of what was going to be a messianic age? You know, there's a passage in Isaiah chapter 2, and it's repeated again in Micah chapter 4. Micah was a contemporary of Isaiah. And in Isaiah chapter 2, the Bible says, "Come now, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of Jacob." The nations of the world are speaking. Perhaps we should turn in your Bibles together. Let's read it together. Isaiah chapter 2, and beginning in verse 2. In the last days, and for many people living in the 20th century, they thought they were in, and rightly so, the last days. In the last days, says Isaiah, the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established as chief among the mountains. It will be raised above the hills, and all nations will stream to it. All nations will stream to it. Many people will say, "Come, let us go up to the mount of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways so that we may walk in his paths. The law will go out from Zion and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He will judge between the nations and will settle disputes with many peoples. They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore." My clicker's stopped working, guys. I don't know if there we go. Battery. There we go. This is a statue of that very event, beating your swords into plowshares, which is outside the United Nations building in New York. the aspirations of the United Nations was that the nations would no longer train for war anymore. And they seized upon this passage from Isaiah about beating your swords into plowshares. And it was these aspirations that also led to the establishment of the nation of Israel. Foreign policy of the United States and Great Britain were both in favour of giving the Jewish people their own homeland. And for many evangelical Christians, this was also a significant time because they believed that it marked the beginning of what would be the last prophetic week of Daniel's 70-week prophecy, Daniel chapter 9. And they thought with the establishment of the nation of Israel, the last prophetic week would see the ushering in of a messianic age. But before that, they believed that there would be a time when the Antichrist would arise. And you might say, where on earth did this understanding of the messianic prophecy of Daniel come from? Well, during the Protestant Reformation of the 1500s, most of Europe, Protestant Europe, had come to the obvious conclusion that the Antichrist power was none other than the Roman Catholic Church. And they could prove it from prophecy, and in order to divert the attention of people away from these prophecies and the obvious implications of what the Bible was saying about the Antichrist, the Roman Catholic Church got two of their brightest minds to come up with an interpretation of prophecy that would take the lamplight, if you like, or the heat of prophecy off of the Roman Catholic Church. The first one was a man by the name of Alcazar. He came up with the theory that all the prophecies of the book of Daniel were fulfilled during the time of a Seleucian king known as Antiochus Epiphanes IV, who desecrated the temple in Jerusalem around AD 67, AD 65, somewhere around there. They said, yep, all that took place way back then. And all the prophecies of the book of Revelation were fulfilled in first century Rome. Nero, the Roman Caesar, was the Antichrist. That was one school of prophetic interpretation, known as preterism. This guy, Francisco Ribera, came up with an explanation that everything in Daniel and Revelation would take place right at the end of time. And the Antichrist was yet to be revealed. And in so doing, with two schools of thought, the Roman Catholic Church succeeded in taking the spotlight of prophecy off of itself. And you might say, well, that was back in the 1500s. How did that bear fruit? Well, in the 18th century, scholars and theologians in most of the universities, and it still is today, believed the idea that all those prophecies took place way back at the time of Jesus. And even today, most of scholarship in most theological colleges believes that, which was the teaching of Alcazar. This guy, Ribera, influenced the thinking of a Scottish preacher by the name of Edward Irvine. Now, Edward Irvine is sort of known as the father of the modern charismatic movement. He had a lady in his congregation, a young Scottish girl, who was known for her hallucinations, speaking in tongues, and prophetic utterances. And Mary MacDonald came up with this idea that there was going to be a secret rapture, that all the Christians would be raptured off this earth at the beginning of a final 7 years of tribulation, and that he would come again at the end of the 7 years and usher in a millennial reign of peace on this earth. Now, Irvine's influence was somewhat limited, but his teaching, and he picked up on this, his teachings were picked up by a guy by the name of John Darby. Now that looks like a bit of a police mugshot, and it probably should have been. This guy Darby took Irwin's teachings to America. And in America, again, he received very limited exposure and very limited acceptance. He was a leader in the Plymouth Brethren. But he came up with the idea of what we call today dispensationalism. Dispensationism, I should say. And that is that human history is divided up into 7 periods or time periods. Innocence, of course, being our first parents in the Garden of Eden. Conscience, being the time before the flood. Rebellion, being the time after the flood and the Tower of Babel. Promise, being the time of Abraham and the patriarchs. Law, being the time of Moses. Grace, being the time of the Christian church. And finally, the Messianic age, number 7, the kingdom, which will be ushered in. Now, Darby's ideas were not strongly accepted, widely accepted, but he did influence a man by the name of Cyrus Scofield. And Cyrus Scofield published his own Bible. It was a King James, but he put his own, it was a reference Bible. He put his own notes inside, pages and pages of notes. And it was Scofield that picked up on this teaching of dispensationism that he'd got from Darby, who he got from Irvine, whom he had got from the Jesuit priest Ribera. And you might think, well, so what? Scofield published his own Bible. This Bible became widely accepted and used amongst Protestants in the United States of America 100 years ago. Very widely. It's still in print today. You can still get Scofield's Bible with his margin notes about the dispensationism. Now, you might say, well, big deal. Well, someone that some of you may remember, this is Hal Lindsey. You could say, well, Scofield was 100 years ago. Hal Lindsey, in the early 1970s, American preacher, wrote a book called The Late Great Planet Earth, and it became almost a number 1 bestseller overnight. And Lindsey put forward this idea that there was going to be a 7-year period of tribulation, that the saints would be raptured away from the earth at the beginning of the 7 years, that the Jewish people would re-establish, hello, is this starting to ring some bells? The Jewish people would re-establish the temple services in Jerusalem for a period of 3.5 years. Then the Antichrist would come, take over the world, abolish the Jewish sacrifice system, and for 3.5 years he would persecute anybody who claimed to be a follower of Jesus. And that at the end of the 7 years, Jesus would come and wipe out the Antichrist and establish his reign on earth. And you might say, well, big deal. This book had a huge influence upon evangelical Christian thought, has had for the last 25, 35 years. So just as much as on one extreme, the scholars in any seminary, theological college, university in the world today have gone down this path that all the prophecies about the Antichrist took place in the 1st century, by the end of the 1st century AD, mainstream evangelical Christianity has swallowed hook, line and sinker this idea of the Antichrist in the future. So at 2 extremes. This is Tim LaHaye and Jerry Jenkins. Tim LaHaye, the older gentleman on the right, more popularly known for his writings on spirituality and temperament and those sort of things. That's probably where he should have stayed. But he got into the idea of writing a book with Jerry Jenkins. LaHaye was the theological brain behind the whole thing. Jenkins was the creative author. They came up with this Left Behind series. And it's probably about 15 years old now, but some of you will remember this. It was very popular in Christian bookstores 15 years ago. And they even made a movie out of it, starring Nicolas Cage. And the whole idea was about people on aeroplanes and in trains and buses, and all of a sudden the pilots disappear because they've been raptured off and these planes crash and the whole world was coming to a standstill. And it was setting up our world, I believe, it was setting up our world for a huge deception that's coming our way. This is our traditional understanding, Seventh-day Adventist understanding of the 70-week prophecy of Daniel. Begins in the year 457 BC. That is attested to by secular historians, locked in. There is no doubt that in the year 457 BC, Artaxerxes, the king of Persia, gave a third decree that the Jewish people could go back home. Now, it was the third decree that had been given, but this was the one that allowed them to re-establish their own nation and set up local government. All the others before had given permission for people to go back to Jerusalem after the Babylonian exile to set up the temple worship, but this one gave them autonomous government. And so in 457 BC, Daniel's 70-week prophecy of 490 years takes us through. There was the first week, prophetic week, 49 years, the rebuilding of Jerusalem, the wall that had to be rebuilt in the time of Nehemiah, well attested to in history. Another 62 weeks brings us up to the year AD 27. Now, in AD 27, we have in our Bibles the Gospel of Luke, and Luke was a historian, loved his history. Luke never made a reference to some historical event without giving some proof. And Luke said in chapter 3 of his book, in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, John the Baptist came baptizing, and Jesus was baptized as well. Guess what? The 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar was AD 27. So right on target, according to Daniel's prophecy, the Messiah arrives. And Daniel's prophecy says he will confirm a covenant with many for 7. And in the middle of the 7, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering. Jesus was crucified in AD 31, and we take the total of the 70 years up to AD 34. And most Christians who follow a historicist system of interpretation will say, well, that was the event when Stephen was stoned. We read about in our Sabbath school lesson this morning. When Stephen was stoned, and as a nation, the Jewish people had rejected the Messiah. Our evangelical friends who have taken on this dispensation theology, though, have taken Daniel's 70 weeks and have thrown the last week way off into the future. How you end up with a 2,000-odd year gap between those events and today without every method of interpretation, of logical understanding, all the things that you would use to guide your study of prophetic understanding has been thrown out the window, and they take this last week and they take it off into the future. But I want to ask you this morning, what does the Bible say about who the Israel of God is? You see, our evangelical friends are so wound up, hooked up in what happens to Israel, the modern nation of Israel today, that it's become a fixation. And they're just waiting for the Israelites to finally have control of the Temple Mount, and they can bulldoze that mosque that's on there, and they can build their own temple, and they can re-establish their sacrificial services. Why would Christians want to see sacrificial services re-established? It's beyond me. But that's what they want to see. Let's have a look at what the Bible says about who the Israel of God is. I'm going to have to fly through this or I'm going to be out of time. This is Abraham. Genesis chapter 18, God said to Abraham, I will establish my covenant with you. All nations will be blessed through you. Because you will teach your household to follow my decrees, my commandments, and my laws. And he said the covenant will be the covenant of circumcision, whether it's your own flesh and blood, your own children, or if it's the servants within your home. They too can be a part of my covenant. So Israel then was more than just Abraham's immediate family. It was anyone who aligned themselves with Abraham. When the children of Israel left Egypt during the Exodus, the Bible says in Exodus chapter 12 that a great multitude went up with them out of Egypt. a great multitude, non-Israelites, went up with them out of Egypt because they could see that God was with Moses and the people of Israel. The time of King Solomon, when they were building the temple, Solomon conscripted labourers to help him in all his building activities. He took a census. It's recorded in 2 Chronicles. Forgot that. Chapter 15, I think. No, it's escaped me for a minute. Chapter 2. He recorded a census of how many aliens were living in Israel at the time. 156,000 people living in Israel at the time who identified themselves with the Jewish nation, but they were aliens. You'll remember that Israel, after Solomon, divided up into the 10 northern kingdoms and the 2 southern kingdoms. And the northern kingdoms went into captivity. The Assyrians finally, we spent a whole quarter looking at this subject in a Sabbath school lesson last quarter. The Israelites were unfaithful to the Lord, and after prophet after prophet after prophet was sent to them to call them back into the covenant relationship with Yahweh, and finally he says, "You made your bed, you lie in it." The Assyrians came and took them captive, and the Israelites who lived in the northern kingdoms were dispersed throughout the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrians had a policy of conquering a nation, taking its inhabitants away and putting other people back in its place. The Samaritans, they became known as the Samaritans, the people they put there. So the 10 northern tribes disappeared into history. As a map of Israel, there were 3 tribes, however, of people who in the days of King Asa, from the tribe of Simeon and Ephraim and Manasseh, there were people who could see that God was with Judah, and they left Israel and came and lived in Judah. So even though many of their relatives and tribesmen were taken captive by the Assyrians, there were large sections of other tribes who also lived within Judah. But of course, the nation of Judah also went into captivity to Babylon. So now the descendants of these people from the tribe of Simeon and Ephraim and Manasseh and Judah and Benjamin went into captivity into Babylon. And it was while they were living in Babylon, and at the end of the 70 years, given the opportunity to return to their homeland, there was many Jews who chose to stay and living in Babylon because that was life as they knew it. That's all they'd ever known. A whole generation or 2 had grown up in Babylon. And in that time, there was a man by the name of Haman, and you know the story well. Esther rescues her people from that wicked man Haman. Guess what? The book of Esther says that a great number of people became Jews as a result of this event. There was a great number of people within the Persian Empire who aligned themselves with the Jewish nation under the threat of this death penalty from Haman, because they saw the miraculous deliverance that took place, and they knew that God was with his people. And so they too became Jews. In the days of King Ezra the priest, when King Artaxerxes had given him permission to go home, the king instructed Ezra to teach anyone living in the Transjordan. Now, if you're on the eastern side of the Jordan in Persia or Babylon, and you say the Transjordan, it's anything on the western side. Ezra was commanded by Artaxerxes to teach anyone in the Transjordan, that is on the western side, about the law of Jehovah. Tell them about your God. Teach the people in my empire on that side of the river. Teach them about your God. That was Ezra's commission. And so the temple that was re-established, Isaiah said, would become a house of prayer for all nations. And in Jesus' own day, when he threw the people out of the temple who were buying and selling there, he said, "My house is a house of prayer for all nations." This is the temple, the steps on the southern side of the temple going up today. And you can still see the old archways. They've been bricked in now, but these were the old archways that led into eternal staircases that came up inside the temple precincts. And on these steps, John records it in his gospel, there was a group of Greek men, Gentile men, God-fearing men who had become they had become circumcised, they were believers in God. They met on the steps with Jesus' disciples and said, "Sirs, we want to see Jesus." So even in New Testament times, there were Gentile people who went up to worship in Jerusalem, went up to the temple to worship. In the last week that Jesus spent in Jerusalem, the Gospels record that one morning he was going into the city and he saw a fig tree. And being hungry, he went up to see if there was any fruit on the tree. Now, you have to understand that a fig tree is a messianic symbol. Because in the Old Testament, it says in the Messianic age, everyone will sit under their own vine and their own fig tree. The fig tree was likened unto the nation of Israel. And Jesus went looking for some fruit on the fig tree. And what did he find? He found nothing. You might remember the earlier parable he told about the tree. And he said to the gardener, "For 3 years I've been coming to look for fruit on this tree. Why does it take up any more room in the soil? Cut it down." And the gardener said, "Leave it there for 1 more year. I'll prune it and I'll fertilise it and see if some fruit bears some fruit. If not, then we'll get rid of it." When Jesus saw that fig tree without any fruit on it, he cursed it. He said, "May no one eat fruit from you again." Do you think Jesus was concerned about a fig tree? He's talking about the nation of Israel. And he's saying, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." In that last week, he told them also the parable of the vineyard. You know that story? The farmer has a vineyard. He rents it out to some tenants. He goes on a long journey. And when it's harvest time, he sends some servants to collect some of the produce from the harvest. And the tenants say, beat up the servants and stone another and throw them out. And finally he sends his son. And what do they do to the son? They say, "Come, this is the heir. Let's kill him and it'll be ours." And Jesus got them to pronounce the sentence. He said, what would happen to those wretches? And they say they need to be killed, and the farm given to someone who will bear its fruit. And Jesus said, "That's you guys. That's you guys. The kingdom of God is going to be taken away from you and given to those who will bear its fruit." And lastly, Jesus said on the Mount of Olives, looked over the city of Jerusalem and said, and he wept. The Bible says he wept. He said, "O Jerusalem, you who stoned the prophets and killed those sent to you, how I longed to gather you under my wings as a hen gathers her chicks, but you were not willing." So, from God's perspective, the nation of Israel had finished its role that it played. Jesus established his church on earth, and he gave his disciples a commission to take the gospel to all the world. And the very first Christians, who were nearly 99.999% Jewish, came to the realisation, and again we studied that this week in our lesson, came to the realisation that the gospel was not just for themselves, it was for the whole world. And so one of the very first councils that were held in Jerusalem in Acts chapter 15, they were wrestling with this whole idea. How do we incorporate these Gentile believers into our midst? We hadn't even factored this in. You know, Jesus said go to Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria and the ends of the earth, but yeah, they're not in our lifetime, surely. But they now had to grapple with these Gentile converts coming into the church. And in a speech, Jesus' half-brother James gets up and says, "You know what, guys? We shouldn't be surprised that there are Gentiles that want to come and join us." He said, because Moses has been preached in every city since the beginning of time. The Jewish religion was not something foreign to a lot of people. Moses had been proclaimed to the Gentiles for centuries. And so when we look at who the Israel of God is, we have to ask ourselves, what does the Bible say about the Israel of God? Let's have a look very quickly. Romans chapter 2. Romans chapter 2, verse 28 and 29. What does the Bible say about this subject? This is the writings of Paul, writing to a group of Christian believers living in Rome. He says, a man is not a Jew if he is one outwardly, nor is circumcision merely outward and physical. No, a man is a Jew if he is one inwardly, and circumcision is circumcision of the heart by the Spirit. Galatians chapter 3, verse 7. The real children of Abraham are those who put their faith in God. Amen. Galatians chapter 3. Consider Abraham. He believed God and it was credited to him as righteousness. Understand then that those who believe are children of Abraham. The Scripture foresaw that God would justify the Gentiles by faith and announce the gospel in advance to Abraham. All nations will be blessed through you. So those who have faith are blessed along with Abraham, the man of faith. Romans chapter 9. This leads us into some very interesting writings of Paul in the book of Romans. Romans 9, 10 and 11. Creates some difficulties for the average Christian as you grapple with these texts. What is Paul saying about Israel here? He goes on. He begins the chapter by saying, I have great sorrow in my heart because my own people have not accepted the Messiah. And he goes on to say in verse 6, chapter 9 and verse 6 of Romans, it is not as though God's word have failed, for not all who are descended from Israel are Israel. Nor because they are his descendants are they all Abraham's children. On the contrary, it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. In other words, it's not the natural children who are children of God, but the children of the promise who are regarded as Abraham's offspring. Chapter 10. He says, brothers, my heart's desire and prayer to God is that the Israelites, that they may be saved. For I can testify about them that they are zealous for God, but their zeal is not based on knowledge. Paul had a heavy heart for his own people. Notice in chapter 11, I asked then, did God reject his people? By no means. I'm an Israelite myself, a descendant of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin. But he goes on in verse 11, again I ask, did they stumble so as to fall beyond recovery? Not at all. Verse 13, I make much of my ministry in the hope that I may somehow arouse my own people to envy and save some of them. Not all of them, some of them. And then he starts talking, uses the analogy of an olive tree. The pedigree olive tree that has these wild olive branches grafted into it. And he says, the natural branches were broken off because of unbelief. But you Gentiles, you're off a wild olive tree. You've been grafted in because you believe. And the root that they tap into, the trunk that they tap into, is the very heritage that you and I have inherited from the Jewish people today. We are recipients of all the knowledge about God that they had from the Old Testament. But then he gives us this challenging verse, verse 26. He says, and so all Israel will be saved. Who is Israel? Is he talking about The nation of Israel? No. You are a part of Israel today. So when we think about Daniel's 70-week prophecy, I have two reasons for sharing this message with you this morning. My first is a concern that there may be some miraculous events that happen in our world that may lead us to think, have we got this right? Have we understood Daniel right? Paul was writing to the Thessalonians, and he said at the end of time, the coming of the lawless one will be in accordance with the work of Satan displayed in all kinds of counterfeit miracles, signs and wonders, in every sort of evil that deceives those who are perishing. They perish, why? Because they refuse to love the truth and so be saved. For this reason, God sends them, that's pretty harsh, I think maybe God allows them to, but God sends a powerful delusion so that they will believe the lie, and so that all will be condemned who have not believed the truth, but have delighted in wickedness. Perhaps events will happen in our world where the so-called born-again types are raptured away off our planet. What if, overnight, several million people just disappeared off our planet? What if the Israelites gained access to the Temple Mount and started to rebuild their temple? What if those things started to take place? Would you start to believe the teachings of dispensationalism? Or would you hold on to our traditional, historic understanding of the prophecies of Daniel? Is this the countdown to the Messiah? Need I remind you, Seventh-day Adventists, that Daniel's 70-week prophecy, Daniel's 490 years, is cut off from a larger time period. A prophecy that takes us through to the year 1844. And the angel said in Daniel chapter 8 that at that time the truths that had been put down by the Antichrist would be restored, that the sanctuary teaching of Jesus as our high priest in heaven would be restored, and that in 1844 a pre-millennial investigation or judgment would begin. Not a post-millennial in 1,000 years of peace on earth that these guys are pushing, but a pre-Advent judgment, not a post-Advent judgment, a pre-Advent judgment. If these things started to take place, where would your faith be? Where would your anchor be? On the events on the news, on CNN, the events that are taking place in Israel, or on God's Word and what He tells us? We believe we are in a countdown to the Messiah because the countdown began in 1844, the time the end began. The other reason I share this message with you today is I want to lay a platform, a foundation for my next presentation to you, because of late there has been a lot of talk and discussion about the meaning and significance of the Jewish feasts for Christians today. Do those Jewish feasts still apply to believers in Jesus in the 21st century? That's my next subject I want to share with you. I want to close just by saying, and this is where you need to listen up, kids, the name Israel, what does it mean? The Israel, if we're talking about the Israel of God, what does the name Israel mean? Where does it come from? It comes from the night that Jacob wrestled with the angel of the Lord, and the angel of the Lord changed his name from Jacob, one who deceives, to Israel, one who has wrestled with God. And the only way you and I are going to be able to stand up against the overwhelming delusions that will come our way at the end of time is if we have first wrestled with God. If we have first made our peace with God. God offers us His peace. Jesus took our penalty at the cross, and He offers us life today. Have you wrestled with God? Have you made your peace with God? Because then you'll be in a position to say that I'm a part of the Israel of God. May God bless you.